The Forgotten Horse and the Unexpected Fortune. A Tale from the Old West. 1883. The winter morning of 1883 was bitterly cold when Jake Murphy, a weathered 52-year-old cowboy, rode along the outskirts of his modest homestead in the Texas frontier. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the frost-covered plains in shades of gold and amber, when something unusual caught his eye. A dark, motionless shape near the old abandoned barn on the neighboring property. At first, Jake thought it might be a fallen tree, or perhaps some discarded wagon equipment left behind by the previous owners. But as he urged his mare, Daisy, closer, his experienced eyes recognized the unmistakable outline of a horse lying in the frozen mud. His heart sank as he approached. The animal was in deplorable condition, ribs protruding sharply through a dull, matted coat, open sores covering its body, and one of its hind legs bent at an unnatural angle that made Jake's stomach turn. The horse was trembling violently, whether from cold, pain, or fear, Jake couldn't tell. Probably all three. Jake dismounted quickly, his worn boots squelching in the icy mud as he knelt beside the suffering creature. "Easy there, boy. Easy now," he whispered, his calloused hand gently stroking the horse's neck. Despite the obvious agony the animal was enduring, when it turned its head to look at Jake, there was still a spark in those brown eyes, a flicker of hope that hadn't been completely extinguished. That's when Jake noticed the brand on the horse's flank. His jaw tightened with recognition and anger. He knew that mark. It belonged to Marcus Thornton, the wealthy rancher who had owned the adjacent property. Thornton had lost everything in a series of bad cattle deals and poker games 3 months earlier and disappeared overnight, abandoning his land, his debts, and apparently at least one of his prized horses. Jake had heard the stories in town, at the saloon and the general store. Thornton had been living like a king, buying fancy imported saddles, building a mansion-style ranch house, making risky investments in railroad schemes that never panned out. When the banks came calling and his creditors closed in, he'd simply vanished one night, leaving behind nothing but broken promises and abandoned property. Without hesitation, Jake knew what he had to do. He couldn't move the horse alone, not with that leg. He would need help, and he would need Doc Patterson, the only man within 50 miles who had real veterinary knowledge, having studied animal medicine back east before coming to Texas to escape his own troubled past. Jake rode hard to town, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. He found Doc Patterson at his small office behind the general store, just finishing his morning coffee. "Doc, I need you to come quick. There's a horse dying out at the old Thornton place. Broken leg, bad shape, been abandoned for God knows how long." Doc Patterson, a quiet man in his 60s with steady hands and kind eyes, grabbed his leather medical bag without hesitation. "Let me hitch up my wagon. We'll need it to transport him if he's as bad as you say." They arrived back at the scene within the hour, bringing along 2 of Jake's ranch hands, Miguel and Tom, strong men who could help lift the injured animal. Doc Patterson examined the horse thoroughly, his experienced hands probing the swollen, misshapen leg, checking the horse's pulse, looking at his teeth and eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, Doc Patterson stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression was grave. "Jake, I'm going to be straight with you, old friend. This animal has been suffering for weeks, maybe months. The leg is badly fractured. Looks like it happened some time ago and never got set. There's severe malnutrition, dehydration, and infection in those wounds. Even if we could save the leg, which is doubtful, the recovery would be long, painful, and expensive." He placed a weathered hand on Jake's shoulder. "The kindest thing, the most merciful thing we could do, would be to put him down right here and now. End his suffering with a bullet, quick and clean." Jake looked down at the horse again. Even in this pitiful state, he could see the quality of the animal, the strong bone structure, the noble lines of its head, the intelligent eyes. This wasn't just any ranch horse. This was a thoroughbred, the kind of animal that would have cost hundreds of dollars in its prime, maybe even 1,000. But more than the horse's value, Jake saw something in those eyes that reminded him of himself. He'd been broken once, too, during the war between the states, after the things he'd seen at Shiloh and Antietam. People had written him off, said he'd never be right in the head again, that the war had taken too much from him. But his wife Sarah had seen something worth saving in him, had stood by him through the nightmares and the drinking and the long, hard road back to himself. "No," Jake said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made up his mind. "We're going to try to save him, whatever it takes." Doc Patterson sighed deeply but nodded. He knew Jake well enough to recognize that tone, had heard it before when Jake set his mind to something. "All right, my friend, but you need to understand what you're committing to here. I'll do what I can, but my supplies are limited. We'll need special equipment, medicines that have to be ordered from back east. The costs could run to hundreds of dollars, maybe more, and even then, there's no guarantee he'll ever walk right again." "I understand, Doc. Let's get started." That cold winter day marked the beginning of an odyssey that would consume Jake's life for the next year and a half. With Doc Patterson's guidance and the help of his ranch hands, they managed to construct a makeshift travois, a sled made from lodge poles and canvas to drag the horse back to Jake's ranch without causing more damage to the injured leg. The first procedure alone was harrowing. Doc Patterson had to set the broken bones without the benefit of modern anesthesia, using only whiskey and leather straps for the horse to bite down on. Jake held the animal's head in his lap for 3 agonizing hours while Doc worked, whispering soothing words, stroking the horse's face, tears streaming down his own weathered cheeks as the animal screamed in pain. Jake converted his best barn into a recovery stable, laying down fresh straw daily, installing a custom-built sling system using ropes and pulleys to support the horse's weight while the leg healed. He fashioned splints from wood planks and leather, changing them regularly as Doc Patterson instructed. Every morning at 4 o'clock, before the sun rose, Jake was in that barn. He would check the splints, clean the wounds with carbolic acid solution that Doc had ordered from a pharmacy in Dallas, apply poultices made from herbs and clay to draw out infection. He would hand-feed the horse, at first just water and soft mash, gradually adding oats and hay as the animal's strength returned. The expenses mounted quickly. Special medicines ordered from the East Coast, bottles of laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for disinfection, wound salves made with mercury compounds, Doc Patterson's visits, which became daily for the first month, then weekly, the cost of extra feed, of the lumber and rope for the sling system, of the time Jake's ranch hands spent helping instead of doing their regular work. Jake's wife Sarah kept the books for their small ranch, and she watched with growing concern as their savings dwindled. They had been putting money aside for years, hoping to buy more land, maybe hire another permanent hand or two. Now those carefully hoarded coins and bills were disappearing at an alarming rate. "Jake," she said one evening as they sat at their simple wooden table, the ledger open before them, "we've spent over $300 already. That's more than we make in a good year. We're eating into the money we saved for emergencies, for our old age." There was no accusation in her voice, just worry. Times were hard on the frontier. A bad winter, a drought, a cattle disease, and they could lose everything. Having savings was the only thing standing between a family and destitution. Jake reached across and took her work-worn hand in his. "I know it seems foolish, Sarah. Lord knows, I've asked myself 100 times if I'm crazy. But when I look at that horse, when I see him fighting to live even though every breath must hurt, I can't give up on him. He deserves a chance." Sarah looked at her husband's face, saw the determination there, but also something else, a kind of purpose she hadn't seen in years. Jake was a good man, a hard worker, but since the war, there had always been a shadow in his eyes, a darkness that never quite lifted. Working with this horse, fighting for its life, seemed to have given him back something he'd lost. She squeezed his hand and smiled. "Then we'll make it work. We always have, haven't we?" The seasons turned. Winter gave way to a muddy, difficult spring. The horse, whom Jake had started calling Miracle because that's what it would take to save him, showed slow but steady improvement. The wounds began to heal, scabbing over and then closing completely under Doc Patterson's careful treatment. The horse started gaining weight, his coat beginning to show hints of the lustrous black it had once been. But the leg remained a concern. Even as it healed, it was clear that the bones had set imperfectly. Doc Patterson had done his best with the tools and knowledge available, but this wasn't like the fancy veterinary hospitals they had back in New York or Philadelphia. This was frontier medicine, rough and ready, doing the best with what they had. 6 months after the rescue, Doc Patterson gave permission to begin carefully reducing the support from the sling system, allowing Miracle to bear more of his own weight. It was a delicate process. Too much too soon could cause the healing bones to break again, but keeping him in the sling too long would allow his muscles to atrophy beyond recovery. Jake spent hours each day in that barn, carefully adjusting the sling, encouraging Miracle to put weight on the leg, massaging the wasted muscles, walking beside him as he took tentative steps. It became a kind of meditation for both of them, man and horse moving together in slow, painful progress toward healing. There were setbacks. An infection in one of the old wounds that required Doc Patterson to reopen and drain it. A fever that spiked so high that Jake spent 3 days and nights in the barn, applying cool water compresses and forcing water down the horse's throat to prevent dehydration. There were moments when Jake thought they would lose him after all, that all the money and effort and hope had been for nothing. But Miracle lived up to his name. He kept fighting, kept trying, his will to survive as strong as Jake's determination to save him. 14 months after the rescue, on a crisp October morning in 1884, Jake entered the barn for his usual dawn check and stopped dead in his tracks. Miracle was standing on his own, all 4 legs bearing his weight, no support from the sling system. The horse turned his head and looked at Jake with those same brown eyes that had first caught his attention over a year ago. But now they were bright and clear and full of life. Jake Murphy, tough Texas cowboy who'd survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War and 20 years of hard frontier living, stood in that barn and wept openly, his shoulders shaking with sobs of relief and joy. "You did it, boy," he whispered, walking over to stroke Miracle's face. "You beautiful, stubborn creature, you did it." By the spring of 1885, Miracle was walking regularly, though with a permanent limp. He would never be a working ranch horse, would never be able to run at full gallop or carry a rider for long distances. But he was alive, and he was content, spending his days grazing peacefully in Jake's best pasture. It was on a warm May afternoon when an expensive carriage pulled by 4 matched horses came up the rutted trail to Jake's ranch. This was highly unusual. Most visitors came on horseback or in simple farm wagons. Sarah came out to the porch to stand beside Jake, wiping her hands on her apron as an elegantly dressed elderly woman emerged from the carriage. She was perhaps 70 years old, wearing a dark traveling dress of fine wool with a cameo brooch at her throat and a hat decorated with ostrich feathers. Despite her obvious wealth, there was something fragile about her, a deep sadness in the lines of her face. 2 men accompanied her. One was clearly her driver, but the other was dressed in a fine suit and carried a leather document case. A lawyer, Jake figured. "Are you Jake Murphy?" the woman asked, her voice cultured, with the refined accent of someone educated back east. "Yes, ma'am, I am. What can I do for you?" The woman removed her gloves slowly. "My name is Eleanor Thornton. Marcus Thornton was my son." Jake felt his stomach drop. He'd heard the news about 6 months back. Marcus Thornton had been found dead in a gambling house in New Orleans, shot in a dispute over cards. Some said it was murder. Others said he'd provoked the fight deliberately, that it was a kind of suicide by proxy, that the shame of his failures had been too much to bear. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Ma'am," Jake said, removing his hat respectfully. Eleanor nodded, her lips pressed together. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy. It has been difficult, but I'm not here to speak of that. I'm here because of what you did. I learned, through considerable effort and expense, about the horse you saved, Midnight Star. He was my late husband's favorite horse, the pride of his breeding program." She looked toward the pasture where Miracle was grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "May I see him?" "Of course, ma'am," Jake said, leading her across the yard, the lawyer following behind with his document case. As they approached the fence, Miracle lifted his head, and to Jake's surprise, limped over to them immediately, as if he recognized something about this woman. Eleanor gasped, her gloved hand flying to her mouth. When the horse reached the fence, she tentatively reached out to touch his muzzle, and Miracle nuzzled against her palm. "Oh, Midnight," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What you must have suffered. I'm so sorry. So terribly sorry." For several long minutes, Eleanor simply stood there, stroking the horse's face, tears running freely down her cheeks, not caring that her fine dress was getting dusty against the fence rail. Finally, she composed herself, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Mr. Murphy, when my son abandoned this ranch and everything on it, I was back in Virginia, caring for my sister who was ill. I knew Marcus was in trouble financially, but I had no idea how bad things had become, or that he had simply left. When I finally learned what had happened, I tried to track down his horses. Most had been sold off by creditors, scattered to the winds." She took a shaky breath. "But then I heard a story, passed from ranch to ranch, about a cowboy who had found one of the Thornton horses half dead and had spent a fortune trying to save it. I hired investigators, and they led me here, to you." Eleanor turned to face Jake directly. "Through Doc Patterson, I learned approximately how much you spent on Midnight's care, the medical treatment, the supplies, your time. I want to make this right." The lawyer stepped forward and opened his document case, withdrawing several papers and a leather-bound checkbook. "Mr. Murphy," Eleanor continued, "my husband Richard Thornton was a gentleman of the old school. He built a breeding empire from nothing, turned it into one of the most respected operations in the South. Midnight Star was one of the last horses he bred personally before he died 8 years ago. My son inherited that business and everything else, and he destroyed it all." She gestured to the lawyer, who handed her a bank draft. "This is a draft on the First National Bank of Virginia for $5,000. It represents reimbursement for your expenses and compensation for your time and care." Jake's eyes went wide. $5,000 was an enormous sum, more than most cowboys made in 20 years. "Ma'am, I couldn't possibly. This is far too much." "It's not nearly enough," Eleanor said firmly, "but there's more. Mr. Harrison here is my attorney." The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles, cleared his throat and consulted his papers. "Mr. Murphy, despite Midnight Star's injury, he is still capable of siring offspring. Mrs. Thornton has retained control of her late husband's breeding operation, which is still functioning under capable management. We have several mares that would benefit from his bloodline." He handed Jake another document. "This is a breeding contract. The Thornton stables will pay you $200 per successful foal sired by Midnight Star. We estimate we can arrange for 6 to 10 breeding opportunities per year for the next several years." Jake's hands were trembling as he looked at the papers. Even if Miracle only sired 3 or 4 foals a year, that would be $600 to $800 annually, more than his entire ranch made in a good year. "But that's still not all," Eleanor said. She nodded to the lawyer, who produced one final document, this one thick and official-looking with a red wax seal. "This," the lawyer said, "is the deed to the former Thornton property. 200 acres adjacent to your homestead, including buildings, water rights, and all appurtenances. Mrs. Thornton purchased it from the bank that foreclosed on her son's debts. She is now transferring it to you, free and clear. Jake felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to simple cowboys, to men who just tried to do the right thing. Why? He managed to ask. Why all of this? Eleanor stepped closer to him, and despite the difference in their social stations, she a wealthy Virginia society matron, he a working cowboy, she looked him directly in the eyes as an equal. Because you saw value where everyone else saw only a burden, Mr. Murphy. You saw life where others saw death. You spent money you couldn't afford, time you didn't have, on a creature that belonged to a stranger that could never repay you. That is the rarest kind of character. Her voice grew passionate. My husband built his entire philosophy around one principle. Character is how you treat those who can do absolutely nothing for you. You proved yours, Mr. Murphy. You are exactly the kind of man my husband would have been proud to know, the kind of man he hoped his son would become. She paused, emotion overwhelming her for a moment. Please accept these gifts. Not as charity, but as what you've earned through your compassion and dedication. Use them to build something good. And please, let Midnight live out his days in peace, knowing he is valued and loved. That afternoon changed everything for Jake Murphy. With the $5,000 and the additional land, he was suddenly a man of substance in the territory. But Jake hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. Over the next 5 years, he used the money wisely. He expanded his herd, hired more hands, improved his buildings and equipment. The breeding fees from Miracle's offspring provided a steady income stream that allowed him to weather the hard times that still came, droughts and harsh winters and cattle diseases. But more importantly, Jake used the old Thornton property to establish something the territory had never seen before, a sanctuary for horses that had been abandoned, abused, or injured. Word spread across Texas and beyond, and soon people were bringing him animals that others had given up on. Some recovered and were sold or given to good homes. Others, like Miracle, stayed at the ranch permanently, living out their days in peace and dignity. Jake never turned away a horse in need, no matter how dire its condition. Midnight Star's offspring proved to be exceptional animals. His first foal, a magnificent black colt, sold for $1,200 and went on to become a champion racehorse in Kentucky. The breeding fees increased accordingly, and Jake found himself with more money than he'd ever dreamed of. But he and Sarah continued to live simply in the same ranch house, working alongside their hands. The money went into the sanctuary, into helping more animals, and into occasionally helping neighbors who fell on hard times. Doc Patterson became a regular fixture at the ranch, treating the rescued horses and marveling at what Jake had built. Eleanor Thornton visited twice a year, making the long journey from Virginia, always bringing sugar cubes for Midnight and staying for several days, treating Jake and Sarah like family. 7 years after the rescue, on a warm spring morning in 1890, Jake stood at the fence watching Miracle. Now 14 years old, his muzzle showing grey hairs, but his eyes still bright and alert, grazing alongside a dozen other rescued horses. The old boy had sired over 30 foals by now, each one strong and spirited, carrying on the legacy of their father and grandfather. Sarah came up beside him, her hair now silver at the temples, and slipped her arm through his. "Thinking about that first morning?" she asked. Jake nodded, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Sometimes I still can't believe it. One decision. One moment of choosing to help instead of walking away, and it changed our whole lives." "You changed everything," Sarah corrected gently. "You could have listened to Doc Patterson that first day. Could have made the easy choice, the practical choice, but you didn't." "I just did what felt right," Jake said. "That's exactly what makes it so special," Sarah replied. "You didn't do it for money or recognition or reward. You did it because a living creature was suffering, and you had the ability to help. The fortune that followed was just God's way of rewarding true goodness." As they stood there, Miracle lifted his head from grazing and looked directly at them, as if he could hear their conversation and wanted to acknowledge it. He let out a soft whinny, and Jake could swear that Horse was smiling. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, painting the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake reflected on the journey. The broken horse had given him so much more than money or land or social standing. Miracle had given him purpose, had reminded him of life's most important lesson, that compassion, even when it costs us dearly, is never wasted. The fortune in his bank account was substantial, certainly life-changing. He was now one of the more prosperous ranchers in the territory. But the true wealth was in the dozens of horses now thriving on his land, in the families he'd helped when they faced hard times, in the community he'd built around the simple principle of giving creatures a second chance. And every single morning, when Jake walked into that pasture and Miracle limped over to greet him, nuzzling his shoulder in that familiar way, Jake was reminded that the greatest fortunes in life cannot be measured in dollars and cents. They are measured in trust restored, in dignity returned, in the light that comes back into eyes that had lost all hope. That was the real treasure, and it was worth more than all the gold in California. Years later, long after Jake and Sarah had passed on, the ranch they'd built continued under new stewardship, but the legacy remained. The Murphy Horse Sanctuary became legendary across the West, a place where broken things could be made whole again, where the forgotten could find value, where compassion triumphed over practicality. And at the center of it all, immortalized in story and song, was the tale of a cowboy who saw worth in what others had discarded, who chose kindness when the easy path would have been indifference, and who proved that sometimes the greatest fortunes come not from gold strikes or cattle empires, but from the simple act of caring for one suffering creature on a cold winter morning. The end.